we thought of having this session, Religion and Politics in China, because it's clear that very few people, or too few people, are conscious, are aware of the importance of the subject of religion in China. It is absurd to say that China would be the only country in the world which is not religious. And not only has China a religious dimension, but this dimension is perceived as very threatening in the long term by the regime. And that was shown in particular the last party congress, the 19th Congress of the Communist Party, and repression is obviously more and more perceivable. So, by the way, we have lost the moderator, who is somewhere in the hotel, but he perhaps has fallen asleep, and this is why I'm introducing the subject. But after all, I am responsible for the organization of this panel, so why not? But I will just retreat in a second after having introduced briefly the two speakers. Franciscus Verhelen, on my left, is a very prominent scholar, very well known by all the sinologues, on dit sinologues, huh? And particularly he's a great expert of the Tang period, but also of religion, the subject of religion in general, and he follows from Hong Kong, where he's based. The two of them actually are based in Hong Kong. He follows very closely contemporary issues as well, and particularly this issue on religion. And Franciscus is the author of many highly scholarly books, but I think this is not going to be the subject of this afternoon or tonight. And Jean-Pierre Cabestan is, so Franciscus is what, 20% French, something like that?
Well, by adoption French, let's say, not by origin.
So you choose the percentage.
Yeah.
And Jean-Pierre is one of the best known experts on China in France, and he has a worldwide reputation. And he has been based in Hong Kong also for how many years, Jean-Pierre?
11 years.
11 years. So Franciscus will start with and focus particularly on this religious aspect, and Jean-Pierre will take the floor next and talk about the political situation in China more generally. And this being said, I thank everybody, and I'm going to sit on the first row because my presence is no longer needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thierry, for this kind introduction. Let me then start with a couple of introductory remarks on the state-religion relationship in China, first at present, and secondly, how it was envisaged in the recent and remoter past. After several decades of renewal, religious renewal in post Mao Zedong China, and especially after the opening of Deng Xiaoping, renewal which enjoyed a large degree of tolerance from the government, we have seen a sudden change this last 2 years. The reasons for these changes, I think, will be ultimately recognized as largely political, but I leave that to my co-panelists to discuss later. Let me just start by putting this religious question into perspective. The first sign was probably in 2016 when Xi Jinping convened and presided personally a conference on the place of religion in society in China. This was the first time that such a high-level conference had been convened in 10 years. So something was in the making there. This was confirmed last year in October 2017 in the 19th Party Congress, which, as you know, decided a number of very far-reaching constitutional changes, including the indefinite term in office of Xi Jinping. Now, what's interesting is that along with these great political decisions, religion appeared once again at the heart of the political agenda of China. What were the measures introduced in 2017? The first and most often talked about is Sinicization of religion. Now, this is a very interesting term and with strange implications, which we could perhaps discuss later if you're interested. I won't have time now to dwell on this. The second was to place religions under the authority of the United Front Department, which is a unit of the Communist Party, which oversees and surveys, let's say, if that term applied to China, civil society, or groups, elite groups that are non-CCP, and their overseas extensions as well. So this organization was given also the authority over ethnic minorities in religious affairs with their overseas extensions. So one can understand a bit what this meant for the situation of religions in China. A third point was patriotic education. Priests had to undergo education in Marxism and patriotism and Chinese culture and so forth. This is a little bit strange when it was applied to Confucian organizations and to Taoist priests, because in the context of Sinicization, since there's nothing more Chinese really than these two things. But so we understand that the Sinicization really means to render religious organizations into conformity with Marxist ideology and socialist values. That was the point. This produced some strange effects like model Taoist, for example. Liang Xingyang is a model Taoist who, after extensive re-education, became an important media figure who declared things like, who came to the defense of China in international controversies like the South China Islands and the expansion in that area, or who declared that publicly that Taoists didn't believe in heaven or in the afterlife and was therefore in conformity with socialist values, and furthermore that Taoism was not suitable for children. Now this was another issue, another policy issue released in that Congress, that minors would not be given access to religious education or to worship activities. So if Taoism is not suitable for children, that's what this means. They should be excluded from early indoctrination, as it was considered. Of course, with foreign religions, Christianity, Islam, the question of Sinicization has some sense. And as far as the Christians are concerned, they still largely organize their own Sinicization sessions and training and re-education. As for Islam, China did not take such risks. As you may know, the 1 million Uyghur Muslims are in detention now in internment camps in Xinjiang, which is their main native area. The mosques are obliged to fly the national flag and to provide training to their children in Chinese culture, Chinese language, and things like that. This is not just Islam that is concerned, but the internment program, yes, which has raised a lot of controversy. This was first noticed by the press, then picked up by the United Nations Human Rights Organization, and all came to the conclusion that this figure of 1 million is about correct. China first denied the existence of these camps, but when aerial photos showed them, we have recently changed their strategy and have legalized the system. So now they exist, and the detainees there are legally detained. Now, these measures have continued beyond 2017. In 2018, in February, a new guideline was issued, which is especially insisted on Chinese religions having to be inspired by Chinese traditional culture. This is an old measure of desacralization, if you like, that was already practiced in the Cultural Revolution. Turn temples into museums and make them part of Chinese cultural heritage, which are worth visiting on that account. And by the way, also become tourist attractions. So this idea of accepting, tolerating religion under the condition that it is a manifestation of traditional culture primarily. Then, in addition to that, the religious doctrine was to be reinterpreted in the light of guidelines issued by the Chinese Communist Party. So you see all of this reflected in the statements of the model Taoist priest. In April of this year, a white paper was published on religion in China, which explains that all of these measures were ultimately to protect religious freedom. Now, this could be a page from the French book of secularism, of laïcité, that ultimately restrictive measures taken against this or that religious organization serve to guarantee the religious liberty of all. So you see that very astute arguments are being used here. The White Book also specifies that civil servants and Communist Party members are forbidden any kind of religious activity or participation in worship or visits to temples. They're liable to prosecution for corruption if they're seen doing these things, because it is a breach of their contract as communists to be exemplary atheists. If we want to measure the potential for social conflict arising from these kind of policies, it's good to think about it for a moment, what actually drove the renewal of religion in post-Maoist China. I think one big issue was the question of values. After a century and a half of disorientation, of systematic destruction of traditional values, there was a real sense that this was needed. Also in the field of morality, especially in the light of government negligence in some of these areas, like consumer protection, food safety, infant formula being adulterated with substances which put lives at risk, infant inoculations to vaccinations were treated. So this raises the question of how far in society can really this kind of immorality be tolerated, and what has gone wrong with the Chinese value system. I think a lot of people felt that this was one motivation for them to re-explore the world of religion. Other attractions are to introduce an element of diversity, perhaps, in a society which is largely uniform and that practices strict thought control. Have a diversity of thought, a diversity of practice, a diversity of ideals. Of course, linked with that is also the identity building aspect that you have in any religious community. The sense that this was a way of affirming and defining your own identity vis-a-vis an extremely intrusive state. To share these communities with like-minded people who share the similar values and similar personal aspirations, which were not subject to social or political control. Also to find an outlet for social engagement. this was again an area where the state was in some ways deficient in education and reaching, in dealing with poverty and charitable issues and so forth. And it has to be said that before this recent turn of events, this was an aspect explicitly recognized by the Communist Party, that religious movements had a useful function in that regard. I would say also the religious doctrines, especially Buddhist and Christian, of universal justice, a sense of justice which proceeds from a law that applies everywhere, even beyond the human sphere, and within the human sphere applies equally to everybody. This was an extremely attractive idea in their own experience, in terms of their own experience, and also doctrines which seek equity, that are egalitarian. Remember that China has one of the highest coefficients of inequality in terms of income distribution in the world. So I think these were attractions that drew people into religions. Confrontation versus cooperation is, of course, the age-old issue in the state-religion relationship. Since I'm an historian, if I still have a minute or two, let me just look backwards a little bit on this issue. I would say that China is and has been fundamentally a religious state. The emperor was the son of heaven. Some Chinese rulers became bodhisattva emperors. Others were ordained Taoist priests. The rise of Taoism as a large-scale social organization in the later Han Dynasty, in the 2nd century, took place against the background of the declining political power of the Han Dynasty. A similar, fast-forwarding a bit to the 19th century, a similar situation prevailed in the Taiping Rebellion, which was a Christian-inspired insurrection, whose leader believed himself to be the younger brother of Christ, and an insurrection which attained a very large proportions and very nearly toppled the Qing dynasty. Why are these questions of political legitimacy and insurrection linked so much with religion in China? I think it's ultimately because the state and religion are conceived on the same model, same cosmic model. They form part of one organic whole. And if one of these two elements is in decline or in trouble, then this calls into question the viability of the other. Hence, in times of dynastic decline, the rise of these kind of religious movements. In between these two incidents that I mentioned, there were, of course, periods of union and of disunion in China. And these were moments where religion stepped in as a legitimation for political power, as interpreters of the heavenly mandate. And you see how religion was played very astutely in that regard, also by foreign leaders. After the unification of the Tang dynasty, the Tang emperors declared themselves descendants of Lao Tzu, thereby merging the imperial cult with the Taoist cult. After the Tang, it was the Neo-Confucianism which arose as the ideology of the late imperial state. So you see that the politics and religion are very closely intertwined throughout the entire history. If you take some later examples of foreign powers, like the Genghis Khan, the Mongol ruler of China and most of Asia, the question of religious policy was very acute for Genghis Khan, because he needed to win the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. And he opted for Taoism, thinking that this was the quintessential, this was the soul of China. This was a way into their mentality and perhaps their affection. The Manchus, for the rulers of the Qing dynasty from the 17th century on, chose the opposite path. Being foreigners, they chose Lamaism, the Tibetan form of Buddhism, as the state religion. So rulers came to different conclusions, but this was always an issue: which religious policy to adopt to win political loyalty and the hearts and minds of the people. Another objective, among the stakes of religious policy, is engineering modernity. In the 19th century, you see this starting, that Chinese intellectuals and statesmen felt that the backwardness of China then was due to its belief system, and getting rid of superstition would help China modernize. The Republic, after the Revolution, the Republic of China continued in this way, and with the movements of iconoclasm, destruction of temples, persecution of religious followers, which is exactly, of course, what you saw continued in the Cultural Revolution after the Communist Revolution. So I mentioned this to show that what we're seeing now, and what we've seen throughout the communist period of government in China, is not something entirely new. Finally, an issue in religious policy is international relations. And the sensitivity about Chinese sovereignty, which has always been there, has of course become particularly acute in recent years. And it's an issue with Sinicization, of course, and with the foreign religions in China. The question of how to bring foreign religious organizations in China to heel of the authorities, and how also to regulate the religious activities of foreigners in China. So, of course, the foremost things that come to mind are the Catholics, the fact that the Catholics in the entire world are under the authority of the Vatican was a sore issue which Chinese thinking about sovereignty could never very well tolerate. Of course, very recently, an agreement has been formed on this subject, which is quite controversial, and especially many of us observers in Hong Kong have felt that this was not a very propitious time in China's relationship to religion to reach out for an agreement in this area. The interpretation you get from the Vatican is very different. If you're interested in this subject, perhaps we can return to that also in the discussion. Islam, of course, is obvious. The fear that the Islam is connected with Islamicist movements around the world and prone to become part of worldwide terrorist organizations, which is obviously also used in part as a pretext to move against these groups. They are ethnic groups too, because Islam in China is strictly identified with ethnic groups, especially the Uyghurs I mentioned earlier, and the Hui, and which is also a way of saying that Islam is not something suitable for Han Chinese. So this foreign dimension too is important. So to sum up, I would say the issue of religious policy is to do with the question of a civic space that religions are capable of organizing within the communist state, which is, of course, part of the aspiration of people who pursue this kind of activity, which is very much part of their dream. I must say that beside values that I mentioned in morality, there are also more metaphysical questions which express themselves in these spaces, like who am I, what is the meaning of life, Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious also. But also I think he meant in addition to displaying ideological zeal and seeking happiness there. So, okay, now there's a vast middle class which has attained this kind of wealth, and they're beginning to ask, well, are there also other sides to happiness beyond ideological zeal, getting rich, and pure materialism? These kind of questions that religious followers the world over ask themselves are, of course, present in China too, and creating these spaces within the state is one of the motivations. Along with creating these separate spaces comes, of course, offering alternative models of society. And you can see that all of these subjects are anathema to the authorities in China. A third one might mention is the power of mobilization, especially in the age of social networking. We're talking here about very large numbers of people. The statistics about Chinese religious practice in China are very difficult to come by. One could say that 80% of all of Chinese people follow some kind of, or believe or practice some forms of Taoism or popular religion and subscribe to Confucian values. So this is something very vast. The authorities and academics in China agree that something like 300 million Chinese are members of, practicing members of religious organizations. So compared to that, the Communist Party is 90 million. And when you're talking about these kind of numbers and the power of mobilization of modern networking, then this is certainly a question for some concern. Now, I'm not saying, and I think the Vatican, in coming to an agreement right now, is not saying that this whole situation is carved in marble and necessarily unchanging. And Chinese rulers have also famously hesitated in adopting their religious policy. Even Genghis Khan, who, as I said, opted for Taoism, later changed his mind and ordered the burning of the Taoist canon. I believe that Xi Jinping may not be somebody so fundamentally and ideologically driven on this question either. It is known that at an earlier time in his career, he said that religious activity is an integral part, and religious activity and aspiration are integral parts of human civilization. Earlier in his career, too, he befriended and supported a Buddhist community. So you see that things are not so black and white. The question now, I think, is why has religious policy in China taken such a radical turn? And I think this is something to do with the present political context, and there I would pass on to my co-panelist.
Well, thank you very much, Franciscus. I feel like being moderator more than the speaker, but let me maybe add a few words about religion and politics in China today to the very comprehensive presentation made by Franciscus. First of all, I think the Communist Party has always had a complicated relationship with religious organizations and religions as a whole, since the regime on the paper is the atheist regime. And that's a big difference with the regime which preceded the Communist Party, Republic of China or Imperial China, where religious organizations were much better accepted by the government. And it's also the case if you look at other Chinese societies than Hong Kong or Taiwan. The cohabitation or coexistence between the state, the government, and religious organizations is much easier than in mainland China. Now, there's been a relaxation of religious control in China since the beginning of the reform 40 years ago. And as Franciscus was saying, there's been a revival of religious activities. But I think a very important distinction which needs to be made has been already alluded to by Franciscus, is the distinction the Communist Party makes between freedom of faith, which is well accepted, and freedom of religious organizations. So religious organizations need to be accepted and monitored and also supervised by the Communist Party. And for a long time it was the SARA, which is a funny acronym, this State Administration for Religious Affairs, which has been in charge of the 5 accepted religions in China. And now the whole administration has been transferred under the Communist Party Central Committee of United Front Work Department. But the way the party state, if I may use the term, administers religions and religious organization has remained the same. And the 5 accepted religions are Taoism, Buddhism, Christianity or Protestant churches, Islam and Catholicism. So it means that on the paper at least, Judaism, Orthodoxy are not recognized or not administered the same way as these 5 religions, although there is a department within the administration in charge of other religions, including in the same basket all these smaller religions in China. Now, in this sinicization of religious activities, there is one thing which is very important, which was also mentioned briefly by Franciscus, is the distinction made by the current leadership, Xi Jinping, between the religions which are presented as Chinese, or mainly Chinese, as Taoism, but also Buddhism, which entered China in the 1st century of BC, and what the authorities deem as Western religions, including Islam, Christianity, and Catholicism. And the way those various religious groups, organizations are managed is very different. One of the concerns of the authority regarding Buddhism is the commercialization of Buddhism. The fact that a lot of Buddhist temples, abbots are involved in business activities which make them very rich, but also which is a perversion of religious activities. And that's one of the dangers which has been, I think, identified by the Xi Jinping even more than his predecessors. But for non-Chinese religions, I think the danger which has been perceived by the authorities is the danger of penetration of other countries. If you take the example of Christianity, the major danger identified by the authorities in the influence of American or Western very active evangelical churches, in particular the ones based in the US. Now, it's not a danger which is isolated from politics, because one of the expressions of the civil society, which is, or manifestation of the civil society, is kind of opening up and diversification, has been the large appeal of Christianity among a number of, elite members. And that's a very intriguing kind of association for the authorities, because you've seen, for instance, more and more dissidents or human rights lawyers in China who become Christian in the middle of their endeavor to protect human rights, or to sort of put pressure on the authorities to open the political system. So that adds up on the danger which is perceived by the authorities, by in particular today. There's been a number of Franciscus mentioned a number of examples of stricter controls since Xi Jinping took over in 2012 of religious activities. One of the best known examples as far as Christians are concerned has been the destruction of crosses of a number of provinces, including in Zhejiang province, where according to some data, something like 12 to 17,000 crosses have been destroyed in this one single province, which for some 5 years at least was ruled by someone very close to Xi Jinping, someone called Xia Baolong. So it's very much sort of also linked to political developments in China, emerging in China since Xi Jinping took over. Now, as far as Islam is concerned, of course, Franciscus mentioned the recent developments in Xinjiang. One thing I would like to add regarding Xinjiang is the fact that the Uyghur movement in favor of independence, or in favor of autonomy, political autonomy, by tradition was not religious. It was a secular movement, the Kemalist movement of Turkish, Kemalist influence and influenced by Turkish modernizers. It became religious rather recently, actually, in the last maybe 20 years. 20 years ago, Xinjiang was not very religious. The Islam practiced by most Xinjiang or Uyghur people, Kazakh and others, is more kind of Sufi, moderate Islam. But there's been elements of radical Islam coming up, which has been also linked to the fight for more autonomy or even independence of Xinjiang in the last 20 years. So that has been a recent development as far as the political situation in Xinjiang is concerned, and which doesn't justify, but explain the reaction of the authorities. Now, the policy which has been privileged by the Chinese authorities the last few months or years that's something we can discuss if we have a bit of time in the Q&A. Is, in my view, very counterproductive, because it may create actually more radical militants than solving the issue. Now, you mentioned and that's one of the motivations for the Chinese society. There's more people in the Chinese society, in mainland China, to embrace religion, lack of trust in society. Now, one of the answers of the authority to that lack of trust, which is, I think, admitted by a lot of politicians or a lot of government people in China, has been the establishment of on the trial basis of what has been called in China the social credit system. And the social credit system's aim is precisely to restore trust among citizens or between the government and citizens. Whether it's going to work is another story, because it's very much a top-down kind of endeavor and project. And I have some doubts, because clearly in what people try to create in embracing religious activities and creating community of faith at the grassroots is precisely community of trusts, which have been sort of put into danger with the sort of both the communist regime, but also the 40 years of reform opening, but also a strategy which has focused very much on of improving material life, but not spiritual life. And the spiritual void has been a big issue. Now, we have to put things into perspective in the sense that, and we may disagree, Franciscus and I, to the magnitude of religious activities, how important religion is for Chinese today. I would add one thing, I mean, to start with, is the fact that contrary to the West, or even including Muslim countries, in China you can sort of get involved in various religions at the same time. You can be all Christian, Buddhist at the same time, which is for us Westerners pretty hard to understand. So the approach to religions may be very different from us. The second thing is, in many urbanized middle class people, religions doesn't matter that much. It's not it's not something which is structuring their life. Yes, people go to the temple, sometimes practice religions, or have some kind of faith, but how important the religion is for them in their daily life is something which we have to put into perspective. The other thing we have to, I mean, Franciscus mentioned a few figures. There are discussions about, I mean, Islam is clearly the Uyghur 20 million, the Hui 20 million or so. So it will remain a minority religion in China, which needs to be protected and guaranteed, but at the same time it's not going to be a big issue. Now the big issue for the Chinese leadership today is whether Christianity is going to be emerged so much that it's going to have, to become more important than any other religion. Now there are debates about the number of Christian people in China. Clearly the Catholic is still a minority, it's 1% of the population at most. But Protestants and evangelical churches are developing very quickly. So experts kind of are divided about how many Christians you have in China. Some people claim that there are more Christian than Communist Party members, so around 100 million Christians in China. I think a more reasonable figure would be 70 million, but still, it's a large figure for China because it goes, I mean, the base was something at the end of the Cultural Revolution, around 20 million at most. So it has increased very quickly. And the fact that among the elites, you've got more and more Christians in China. And among the counter-elites, so the elites, political elites, who want to put pressure on the system to open up the political system, are also very often Christian. So Christianity is perceived for these reasons even more of a danger by the Chinese government. So the question is, what kind of cohabitation in the coming years the government will accept with a lot of churches which are not really underground, but which are tolerated at the local level, but are not really associated with what we call the major Protestant organization, which is the Three Self Christian Association, which is under the supervision of the government. So you've got what we call a lot of house churches in China. When they remain small, they're tolerated. When they get too big, they dismantle, but again, as Franciscus was mentioning at the end of his presentation, the situation is not black and white, it's kind of gray, because you've got a lot of tolerance. among the authorities, for reasons which have to do with the fact that religion is perceived by the authorities as useful to some degree. To use Marx's expression, which is well known, religion, the opium of the people. It's an opium which, if it's used as in a moderate way, is perceived as a stabilizing force for the Chinese society, including by the authorities. Now, and religious organizations also play a useful role in charity, in social programs, and they. Again, I mean, we have some. If you look at the past, I mean, particularly the Kuomintang, when the Kuomintang was in power in China, you see the same kind of use of religious organization to supplement the government's social policy, which sometimes are not, strong enough to fulfill all the needs of the poor, or the disadvantaged of the Chinese society. So again, I think there is some acceptance of religious organization, but the party wants to be in control of any kind of organization. Finally, and that's the bottom line, I think, of the authorities, this danger of what the Communist Party calls foreign infiltration. And foreign infiltration not only for changing the soul of the Chinese people, but also changing their political mind and sort of precipitating a peaceful evolution of the regime towards another kind of political system. And that's why Christianity will remain perceived by the authorities with a lot of suspicion in the coming years, and much more the Protestants, I have to say, than the Catholic Church as such. So now the context itself, and I've been too long maybe on religion, but is a context in which the Communist Party is trying to strengthen its ideological discourse and propaganda. But here you've got an irony in the sense that China and the Chinese society has never been more globalized. The youth is, very much plugged in and connected to the outside world. But at the same time, it looks like the Communist Party today under Xi Jinping is trying to isolate or re-isolate China from the rest of the world. And here there is a big irony in the situation, and I think a tension for the future of China's relation with the outside world. And that's something we may come back to in the Q&A. So I'm going to stop here.
Jawad Kaltouti, je suis président de l'Institut marocain des relations internationales. Et j'ai été très intéressé par ce panel, étant donné que nous avons très peu d'informations sur le problème de la religion en Chine. Et donc, je remercie les panélistes de nous avoir donné cette occasion. Ma question est la suivante. Est-ce que la Chine subit des influences, notamment du Vatican, pour ce qui concerne le catholicisme, et de la part de l'Organisation de coopération islamique ou de la Turquie en ce qui concerne l'islam? Merci.
Si je peux répondre à cela, je ne pense pas que la Chine reçoive ces influences. C'est plutôt une crainte, c'est plutôt le rejet de toute possibilité d'ingérence dans leurs affaires souveraines qui les motive à ce type de mesures. On a vu ça avec la négociation avec le Vatican qui a duré très très longtemps. Il n'est certainement pas question de subir les influences. La question c'est plutôt comment se partager par exemple l'autorité sur l'élection des évêques. Et c'est un vrai partage. Le Saint-Siège va approuver le choix des évêques, mais préalablement sélectionné par le Parti communiste. Donc c'est un compromis, etc. Je pense que l'influence des mouvements islamistes a été très, très faible à l'origine. Comme le disait Jean-Pierre, en fait, les communautés ouïghours étaient très peu connectées avec le monde et très peu inclins à une activité terroriste. Ça a changé et ça va continuer à changer sous cette pression, je pense, parce que c'est typiquement cette victimisation qui poussent des groupes comme ça vers des réponses extrêmes et à ce moment-là, à la prise de contact avec leur contrepartie ailleurs, à l'étranger.
Je peux peut-être rajouter, rajouter 2 mots sur le catholicisme. Le rapprochement actuel entre l'Église catholique, le Vatican et Pékin est un processus long et compliqué. Il est contesté par un certain nombre de catholiques chinois. Je pense à la tribune que vous avez peut-être lue dans le New York Times hier de cardinal Zen, qui est un cardinal hongkongais très anticommuniste et très réticent et très inquiet du rapprochement actuel. Je pense que cependant, il n'y a pas de solution idéale. Un peu comme le Vietnam, pour le Vietnam, le Vatican va devoir trouver une forme de compromis pour que à la fois l'Église catholique reste autonome et surtout soit à nouveau liée au Vatican, tout en évidemment opérant dans un système où chaque organisation religieuse est gérée, enfin du moins contrôlée par l'État ou par le parti. Donc c'est ce type de compromis vers lequel on va et ce qu'on appelle l'église du silence, l'église souterraine et l'église officielle sont en fait très mélangées, enfin très superposées. Elles ont beaucoup de relations entre elles et donc il n'y aura pas une marginalisation de l'une par rapport à l'autre. Je pense que les deux vont se fusionner dans une organisation qui sera forcément supervisée par le gouvernement. Maintenant, pour ce qui est de l'islam et de la Turquie, vous avez mentionné la Turquie, ce qui est vrai, c'est qu'il y a des communautés ouïghours un peu partout dans le monde, principalement en Turquie, en Allemagne et aux États-Unis, et que ce sont des communautés qui à l'origine étaient donc, plutôt séculaires, laïques, qui avaient une revendication essentiellement politique et qui maintenant sont beaucoup plus éclatées. Mais si vous prenez ce qu'on appelle le World Uyghur Congress, le congrès ouïghour mondial, c'est une organisation qui ne se veut pas religieuse, qui se veut politique, qui maintenant a abandonné officiellement en tout cas la revendication d'indépendance, mais qui souhaite une autonomie politique. Et se distingue, cette organisation qui prétend représenter la majorité des Ouïghours, se distingue des mouvements les plus extrémistes, qui sont liés à des mouvements extrémistes en Ouzbékistan, au nord de l'Afghanistan et au nord du Pakistan. Et qui sont, à mon avis, on a parlé de l'ETIM, qui était East Turkestan Islamic Movement, qui est un mouvement qui est apparu après 9/11, après le 11 septembre, mais qui est un mouvement qui reste, donc connaît mal en fait, le contenu, et qui reste, à mon avis, minoritaire dans le panorama.
This clock is blinking at us. You can't see it out there, but it's telling us the session's at a close. I wish to thank our 2 speakers for their excellent presentations, informative. The only religion they did not include in the discussion was the ideologues in the Communist Party of China. And that is a system of faith just like many other religions. I don't know if it includes Xi Jinping, but it includes many ideologues in the Communist Party, and they have their own faith which they want to promulgate throughout China. So we'll close on that remark.
Thank you.